report. All right.
So thank you, everybody, for coming today. We are here to celebrate International Working Women's Day. Not Women's Day, as the marketeers seem to have rebranded it, but International Working Women's Day, the day of the working class woman, as established by revolutionary women in Russia back in 1917, I believe. So I'm not going to do a big introduction. I think what we'd like to do is listen to Ella's presentation. And in the discussion afterwards, what we might do is give a little bit of space, since a few of Harpal's old comrades are here, give a little bit of space to talking about our dearly departed Comrade Harpal. But for now, we are going to focus on International Working Women's Day. And Comrade Ella here has prepared us a presentation on a very important British woman communist, Sylvia Pankhurst. So without further ado, Comrade Ella.
Okay, thank you. I mean, we'd been meaning to have a presentation on Sylvia Pankhurst for quite some time. And of course, in the CPGB-ML, and even before the CPGB-ML, we were trying every year on International Working Women's Day to have a presentation on some woman or lady who had made an important contribution to the revolutionary movement. And so this year it's the turn of Sylvia Pankhurst. She's a lady who has been very much neglected of late. When you actually sort of Google votes for women, then her mother, Emmeline, comes up, her sister, Christabel, comes up, but Sylvia, who previously was the one you most associated with the whole issue of the suffragettes, somehow is on page 4 or 5 or 6 of your Google search, and you might never get round to it. But anyway, here she is. Now, there is an article, quite a long article in Lalkar, and I'm assuming you've all read it, so I was rather focused on pretty pictures this time, and you probably know actually more about Sylvia Pankhurst than I do just at this point. So, but you'll get your chance to put in your tuppence worth after I've done my bit. So anyway, that was Sylvia, and as I said, she was most known for being a suffragette. And in that, she was following in the footsteps of her mother, her grandmother, her sister, both her sisters, in fact. So it was very much in the family, the suffragette votes for women business. But she was also an artist, and this is something that is somewhat neglected about her. I wanted to bring in pictures by because she was not just an artist. She went to art school, she went to the Royal Academy, she had the highest qualifications, and she was a major professionally trained artist, and she did some excellent work. And it was mentioned to me that some of her paintings were in the Tate Modern, Tate Britain rather. So I looked it up because I thought, well, I'll go and see what they've got and bring it in for you to see. And when I looked it up, I saw that they had 4 works by her, 3 of which you only get to see if you make an appointment. And that had to be on a Saturday. There's no way I was going to do it. But luckily, you look online, you can find these pictures, and they're not necessarily easy to get hold of because they're carefully mastered so that you can't just save as picture. You have to actually take a screenshot and do all sorts of complicated things. But these are the things that Sylvia liked to paint. That's women at work. So the first lady here is at the potter's wheel. The second lady is a cotton worker. And fun enough, when I was in Xinjiang, we went into a cotton factory, and all those spools were there. And in the painting, she's got them as if you could actually touch them. There's amazing detail. And guess what the third painting is? herself. It's a self-portrait. I must say, I think she's probably more good-looking than that, but there you are, that was a self-portrait. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about her family. As I say, it was quite a progressive family. She had a great-grandfather who was present at the Peterloo protest in 1819. And, you know, that was quite hairy. You'll remember the troops came and shot at everybody, and he managed to survive that. But so his wife, her great-grandmother, was active in the Anti-Corn League, again, a big movement for the corn bread to be cheaper for the workers. Her grandfather, Robert Goulden, campaigned against slavery. Well, Robert Goulden was a rich businessman. He'd started out very modestly as a messenger boy, but he hit lucky with the business that he was able to set up, and he was really quite wealthy. But obviously his business depended very much on contacts, and when his family started taking up all these anti-establishment positions, even ones that he agreed with, he felt he had to break off contact with them in order to preserve his position. But anyway, her grandmother, that's Robert Goulden's wife, who was Sophia Crane, and she was a very early feminist and activist in the Votes for Women campaign. So there you are, you can see her looking very militant. So that's her father, Richard Pankhurst. He was a very eminent lawyer. He had connections through the Liberal Party, of which he was a member, and in that capacity, he was involved in drafting the Married Women's Property Act in 1882. Now, you'd be amazed to know that until then, a married woman had no property. Everything she owned belonged to her husband. So the Married Women's Property Act was quite a big step forward, that the married women were allowed to have their own property. Anyway, he stood for women's rights, for home rule for Ireland. I mean, that was just amazing in those days for a respectable middle-class Englishman. He was entirely in favour of home rule for Ireland. But in the fullness of time, he became a member of the Independent Labour Party because his anti-war positions, which originally the Liberal Party had espoused, the Liberal Party abandoned, and for 10 years after he resigned from the Liberal Party, he was out in the cold, but then was able, with Keir Hardie, to join in forming the Independent Labour Party. He died in 1898. He stood for Parliament as an independent, and Sylvia, as a little girl, would be helping him go around Manchester, you know, knocking on doors, trying to get people to vote for her dad. And in that capacity, this brought her into contact with working class people, and she liked them. You know, she related to them, and she was also reading Dickens, and of course Dickens was very good at characterizing both the lives and the adaptability, the strength and the humor of the people who were terribly poor, as well as pulling hard on the heartstrings. So all of that made her very, very much a sympathizer with the working class, but not just somebody who sympathized, but somebody who also respected. And this started very early when she was campaigning with her father in Manchester. Now, this Independent Labour Party, which Richard Pankhurst had helped to form, was a very strange party in that it wanted to represent the voice of the working class, but it was entirely pacifist. It disapproved of strikes. It felt that people should be voting for the right sort of people in Parliament, because then the Parliament would take care of all their needs, ha. So anyway, so to that extent, it was always a very backward party. I mean, while, or just before it was formed, there'd been the Match Girls strike in London, and this Match Girls strike had been extremely successful. And then there was a dock strike in 1889, again, extremely successful. Everybody out, and the strikers got what they wanted. But this wasn't something that the Independent Labour Party approved of. They said, no, what we need is more people in Parliament, and then we'll make sure that people are properly treated and they won't need to go on strike anymore. So anyway, that was the attitude at the time. So on the next page, what have we got? That's her mother, the fabulous Emmeline. Now she was, again, a very early activist in the women's suffrage movement, and she formed something that was called the Women's Franchise League. And next to her, somebody that you probably don't hear much about, and somebody I really only found out about literally yesterday, was Mary Clark. She was Emmeline's sister, and she was the first woman suffragette to die as a result of force feeding when she was in prison. So that shows just what a progressive family she was belonging to. Then her sisters. She had an older sister, Christabel. Christabel was a law graduate, and she was very hot on votes for women, but really her interest began and ended with votes for women. She had a younger sister, Adela, and Adela was closer in her thinking to Sylvia herself, closer in her thinking to Sylvia's father, in which, you know, she was interested in the working class and working class women, and had confidence in them being able to fight for themselves, and of the need for them to be mobilized to fight for what was right. But anyway, she was considered, as indeed Sylvia was, a bit of an embarrassment to her very bourgeois mother, and she was given a one-way ticket to Australia to get her out of the way. And when she got to Australia, she founded the Communist Party of Australia. Unfortunately, after that, I'm afraid she slid backwards, and at one point, apparently, she was even sort of a bit keen on the fascists, but hopefully that didn't last. But anyway, that was Adela. So just goes a little lesson, you get something wrong and you can go badly wrong. So talking about her political trajectory, in age 16, she began an affair, at least we assume it's an affair because it's evidenced by a lot of extremely passionate letters, with the founder of the Independent Labour Party, Keir Hardie, who was a friend of a family. Now, Keir Hardie actually looks exactly like one of the comrades we met in Leeds the other day. Do you remember him? Yes, I mean, it's almost impossible to tell the difference between them. Keir Hardie had started work as a miner at the age of 7, but he went on to become a prominent union leader, and the relationship between him and Sylvia, who was 20 years younger than him, lasted until he died in 1915. But by that time, he was in the Labour Party proper, but he was opposed to the war. So basically, compared to the average Labour Party member, he was a good bloke. So, but anyway, this was the sort of influence she was getting from the radical social democrats, and she absorbed it all. At the start, I don't know what that noise is, do you?
Someone's phone.
Then comes the Women's Social and Political Union. Yeah, Emmeline used to get Sylvia to do the paintings. She was marginalized from the center of things, but she'd like to get her to do her artwork in order to decorate, or banners and things for the women's movement. And she was called to decorate a hall that was being inaugurated, called Pankhurst Hall in Manchester, in honour of her father, who had died 2 or 3 years previously. And so she gave it her all, decorated it beautifully, only to find when it was finished that the hall wouldn't be open to women. It was for men only. And so upset was her mother, Emmeline, at this, that she formed a new women's organisation called the Women's Social and Political Union. Now, there was already an organisation which purported to be in favour of women, which is the National Association of Women Suffrage Societies or something of that nature. But the thing is with them is that they were completely committed to legal action only. So it was all writing to your MP and very tame little protests. But Emmeline became convinced you needed something a little bit more fierce than that. And the Women's Social and Political Union was formed in order to fight in a rather more effective way. Their slogan was "Deeds, not words." But the deeds that they had in mind, a lot of them were a bit reminiscent of Extinction Rebellion. They were in favour of burning down the houses of MPs, of smashing shop windows, setting fire to letterboxes and things of that. And also they used to go to meetings to harass opponents, which I think is legitimate, but I think the nicer ladies wouldn't do that, but they had no pretensions or desire to be nice, and they would actually go and heckle at meetings. And in fact, at one meeting where Sylvia went to, she was heckling Winston Churchill, who was then a Liberal, and saying, what's the Liberal Party going to do about votes for women? And Churchill's response was, "Not in my lifetime." And Sylvia, in the meantime, was bundled out of the meeting and, locked in a room where she could make less of a nuisance of herself. So this is how this worked. But basically, Sylvia was most concerned with working class women in this context. And she set up a branch of the WSPU in Bow, and she actually went to live in Bow or in Poplar in the East End, where she stayed for very many years. And so while she was in the WSPU, quite serious differences arose between her thinking and the thinking of her mother and sister, who basically ran the WSPU. They were really limited in their vision to the one-point programme, which was votes for women, whereas Sylvia was much broader than that. I mean, to start with, the WSPU took the Independent Labour Party line, and they were opposed to strikes. They said, the strikes harm women, and they're wrong. We shouldn't have strikes. We should be lobbying for women to have the vote, because with women's votes, there'll be a much greater weight of working class votes, and we'll get the right people in Parliament. Well, Sylvia didn't really care for that line at all. She always supported strikes, for instance, when she'd been sent off to America to get her out of the way, to do a tour promoting a book that they'd got her to write to get her out of the way. She came back it was a very successful tour, by the way. She had audiences of 20,000. It was just amazing. And they were all very interested in what she was doing. But when she came back, there was the dock strike. And, she was supportive. The SPU wasn't. But the other major issue was the question of war. Then, you know, Sylvia was dead against the war, whereas the WSPU believed in, you know, dropping everything to support the war. And of course, that sooner or eventually led to a split. So, but in the meantime, before the split came, and even though she had disagreements with the policy of the WSPU, she was very active in supporting what the other ladies were up to. So, you know, if they were, the first time she was put in prison, incidentally, she was there, she went to the court where the women who had been arrested on some activity or other. It was a fairly innocent activity, actually. They'd managed to get into the lobby of the House of Commons, and they were making a bit of a nuisance of themselves, and they got arrested, and they were up before the beak the following morning. She went there to make a big fuss and to shout, and anyway, she ended up in prison for 6 months. And went on hunger strike and was force-fed and all that sort of thing. So, you know, she gave her all. At another time when members were arrested, she organized an enormous rally from her East End working women in Hyde Park in support of them. And another time, she went to a meeting, this perhaps was not what they would have approved of. She went to a big meeting organized by the Daily Herald in the Albert Hall in support of the Dublin workers who had been locked out. And James Connolly was there. Obviously it was a meeting to support the workers, and she was a very, very firm supporter of that movement. But these were things which just caused a big rift with her family. And in January of 1914, basically the East London branch of the SWPU was expelled. Let me just see where I got to here. Oh, I went a bit ahead of myself there.
Well, go back and read some of that, so it's useful.
Did you think so?
Yeah.
All right. What would you like me to read? Well, no, I mentioned this one, the unlawful activity and all the rest of it, and her force feeding. She began to reject the reasoning behind violent behavior. That point is useful, that the better off women needed to sacrifice themselves for the benefit of the sisterhood in general, and veered more and more towards the view that working class women need to struggle for their own liberation rather than waiting for it to be graciously bestowed by their betters. Yeah. So obviously once World War I broke out, then the split had to happen. Well, it anticipated the start of World War I to a certain extent. The Bow branch of the WSPU was expelled, and it reformed itself as the East London Federation of the Suffragettes. Incidentally, that word suffragette is interesting because this was adopted by the WSPU when it set itself up against the earlier organization of the National Organisation for the Women's Suffrage Societies, because they called themselves suffragists. But WSPU introduced this suffragette, so that's where that came. So anyway, it was the East London Federation of Suffragettes. And at this time, Sylvia then opened a newspaper, which she called the Woman's Dreadnaught. And when she opened it, it had a circulation of 20,000. Wow, those were the days. It focused its activities during the war with helping women who were in difficulties as a result of the war. She organized milk for the babies. She set up cost-price restaurants. She set up a factory to make toys for children, because the toys had been imported from Germany, you see. And so she actually said, no, we'll make them here. And she actually employed people, and she insisted that women should get the minimum wage that men were getting if they were working in the factories or in the kitchens that she had set up. So it was very progressive. But the ELFs, ELFS itself, more or less kept quiet about the war. They remained neutral. They just devoted themselves to good works. But the Women's Dreadnaught certainly didn't stay silent on this particular topic at all. And it had a number of things that it reported. For instance, one woman was reported as saying, "Don't mention the soldiers." People saying, well, you know, you've got to make sacrifices for our boys. She says, "Don't make the soldiers. England at twopence halfpenny an hour just isn't worth fighting for." So this is the kind of thing that she was happy to publish. And then also the case of a woman called Melvina Walker, who had been arrested under the Defence of the Realm Act because she said in a meeting in Hyde Park, "Why should we send mothers' sons to murder other mothers' sons?" She says, "It's up to us to end the war," she said. And this is the kind of thing that the Woman's Dreadnaught would be publishing. Right, let's move on from there. And so we start on the road to socialism. Now, in 1916, people were getting pretty fed up with the war, and this was evidenced by the fact that they had to introduce conscription because young men weren't volunteering enough. It's a bit like Ukraine at the moment, isn't it? You'd run a mile. At this point, I think Sylvia had started to think, we've got to take this wider than women's suffrage. And what she did was, let me just find this little bit I wanted. Her paper was supporting the Etapla mutiny. It supported the strikes of the workers in East End companies which were supplying army clothing. So you can just imagine. It published the letters of an East London Jewish boy who was shot for desertion when he was suffering, poor lad, from PTSD. So she was making the case against the war in a serious manner, and she realized that basically she was working for men as well as for women. You know, it was silly to just to be a woman's organization. And as a result of that, the Dreadnaught became the Workers' Dreadnaught instead of the Women's Dreadnaught. The Women's Suffrage Federation became the Workers' Suffrage Federation, and subsequently it became the Workers' Socialist Federation. And as the Workers' Socialist Federation, it was quite well known as it embarked on negotiations to form a communist party in the fullness of time. So in 1917, something very important happened. I wonder if you can remember what. Well,
read that quote.
Which quote was that?
On the picture.
On the picture, okay. She said, "Our eager hopes are for the speedy success of the Bolsheviks of Russia. May they open the door which leads to freedom for the people of all lands." So, and this galvanized people. There was as soon as the war ended, which was not very long after the Russian Revolution, there was a real post-war turmoil. So workers were mobilized en masse. They were very militant. The chaps were coming back from the war. They'd been promised a home fit for heroes, and they came back to absolute rubbish, unemployment, starvation, nowhere to live. It was totally miserable. And these were armed men. These were men who knew how to fight, coming home. and feeling very angry and annoyed at both at what they had gone through, which was quite unnecessary, and at how they were being treated on their return. So actually in 1918, 6 million days were lost to strikes. Even some of the police went on strike. And the result of it all is that the bourgeoisie felt it necessary to make a few concessions. After all, there was the example of Russia. And one of the measures that the Russians had taken, for instance, was to give the vote to men and women alike. Wow. So anyway, this is one that the bourgeoisie felt it had to concede in this country. So they gave the vote to men, all men over 21, whereas previously they'd been restricted by their property, whether they were property owners, and to all women over 30. Well, us poor little
When you're
things.
properly grown.
Yes. Well, when you're nearly properly grown up, as near as you're ever going to get. Yes, okay. But nevertheless, such was the anger that the government even had to send troops in certain cases to quell the riots that were taking place. Now, one thing I found very interesting is that whereas the books I'd read on Sylvia described this working class militancy as anger at the bourgeoisie and at the rotten conditions after the war, when I did a Google search, it all came up as race riots. And obviously, in terms of how this was dealt with, the troops was one weapon used against the working class, but the working class's own race prejudice was the other weapon used against the working class, and it helped to defeat that early militancy that was so dangerous to bourgeois interests. And I'd like to emphasize this especially because this race prejudice is the Achilles heel of the British working class. It's still strong enough for it to be mobilized by the bourgeoisie against the working class. And we've seen it. We've seen angry workers being diverted to do what? Burn down asylum seekers' hostels. I mean, really, what do they think they're gaining? So any work that we can do to educate workers to understand that asylum seekers, people who are different color, people who've got a different religion, they're not the ones who are responsible for your problems. In fact, they have the same problems as you have. And this should continue to be a very major part of our work. Now, there are people who think that the way you deal with people like that is to go and beat them up. Well, no, because very often they're just people who are muddle-headed and they need to be talked to. So wherever you get the chance to talk to people who've got wrong ideas, and I can tell you, even people who think that they're communists, even people who think they're Marxists, tend to be a little bit weak about, well, they're coming and they're taking our jobs, and we have to just put them right in the firmest possible way. It's just not acceptable to fail to understand that that worker is a worker the same as you are. He's your ally, or potentially your ally. You should work for him to be your ally. You should certainly, under no circumstances, consider him to be your enemy. Your enemy is the bourgeoisie. It's the bourgeoisie that's taking your jobs. It's not anybody else. So let me move on to say that in this term...
Which was the prejudice that they used, though? Against
Race
Irish, against Jews, against what?
No, they were against black people.
Were there any?
Yes, and what's more, they'd been fighting in the war, and they were coming back to England after the war, and they would be in, they would go to Liverpool and Cardiff, the port cities, and that's where the riots were. You know, they're carefully directed against these foreigners that are coming here to take our jobs. It was very much colour prejudice.
They've been very numerically insignificant at that point.
Well,
But
quite.
in the port cities, they were
In the port
long-standing.
cities, yeah.
Bristol,
Liverpool.
Cardiff, Liverpool, Glasgow, they're all places that had, for quite a long time, a significant black population.
Yeah, and we're never going to get anywhere unless we can convince workers to see sense. We can't make a revolution with when everybody wants to run after minorities rather than run after the bourgeoisie. Well, the bourgeoisie are a minority, we can run after them, that's what we should do. Now, another aspect of the turmoil was that workers, including soldiers, were very determined. They didn't want to go to war again. They didn't want the war to be to bring down the Bolshevik government. They resisted being mobilized to go and help the intervention in Russia. So on the 3rd of January 1919, 10,000 soldiers in Folkestone refused to be sent for service abroad, and thousands more mutinied. Sailors mutinied at Milton Haven, and they raised the red flag on HMS Kilbride. That would have been a good picture on the front of Lalkar, wouldn't it?
That sort of thing.
And Sylvia was elected to the committee of Hands Off China, Hands Off Russia rather, and the British Socialist Party, the Socialist Labour Party, and the industrial workers of the world were all represented there. And in May 1920, the big occasion, the dockers refused to load guns in London for Poland on the Jolly George. And the action quickly spread. We very often hear how wonderful the dockers were, because but it wasn't just the dockers. The coal workers refused to produce any coal for the ships that were arming Poland and so on. So here were all these struggles going on, but what Britain didn't have at that point was a communist party. It had these various, left-leaning, even sort of slightly Marxist parties, but they didn't have a communist party. And all that anger was being dissipated. You needed a communist party to bring it all together and point it in the right direction. So the Third International was begging the communists in Britain to unify and put together a communist party. So the main organisations involved were the British Socialist Party, again the Socialist Labour Party, and the South Wales Socialist Society. That was made up of mainly of miners from South Wales. But there was a big issue of disunity, and that was on the question of participation in bourgeois elections and support for the Labour Party. Now, Sylvia absolutely hated the Labour Party. I mean, having been presumably a fan at the time when she was friendly with Keir Hardie, she'd since moved on since his death to a friendship with somebody called Silvio Corio, who was an Italian, anarcho-syndicalist sort of person, but very, very, these are people who had absolutely no time for a bourgeois Labour Party. She had seen how the Labour Party had supported the war. She thought they were absolutely disgusting, and she didn't want to have anything to do with the Labour Party, which we could very much understand. It was a very understandable position. And of course, the participation in bourgeois elections to this day is something which divides communists very much. So initially then, it wasn't possible because of this issue to put together a communist party. So page 15, is it? Yeah. But anyway, Lenin, in response to all this, put forward a famous pamphlet, Left-Wing Communism, an Infantile Disorder, which is still used against us by the revisers. And it's a pamphlet that's very important to understand. But Lenin said, yes, Sylvia, you are right in what you have to say about the reactionary nature of the Labour Party. There's no question about it. But the mass of workers don't know that. And that being the case, it's right to affiliate in order to have access to this mass of workers so that they can hear what you have to say. He did put a very, very strong proviso on this. This is so long as you have the right to say it. And not so long ago, our party was involved in an alliance of this kind on the basis that we were going to have the right to say, to put forward revolutionary politics, our politics. And guess what? That very soon disappeared. So there you are. Once, if you don't have the right to propagate to the masses of workers, what's the point of your being there? You might as well not bother. I mean, but anyway, other parties were swayed by Lenin's arguments, but Sylvia, set up her own party. Well, she turned the Workers' Socialist Federation into the Communist Party British section of the Third International, and she was going to go it alone. So anyway, the Third International thought, well, we've got to do what we can to overcome this problem, and Sylvia was invited to attend the second Congress of the International, which took place between the 19th of July and the 7th of August 1920 in Moscow. I think it was partly in Petrograd and partly in Moscow, but Sylvia went to Moscow, and it was quite amusing at that time because Sylvia had been arrested, and she was awaiting trial under the Defence of the Realm Act because her newspaper, the Workers' Dreadnaught, had published an article actually written by a Jamaican journalist saying that, encouraging soldiers to mutiny and defect, terribly naughty. And it's really quite, another thing, I mean, the fact that she employed a black journalist in those days was amazing. It was the first time anyone had employed a black journalist, and people were gobsmacked by it. But anyway, as part of her arrest, her passport was confiscated. So she actually had to be smuggled onto a freighter at Harwich and taken out to Sweden, and she then caught a train which took her to Moscow. When she came back, she was promptly picked up and thrown into jail. And unfortunately, this time she couldn't go on hunger strike because she just learnt that an Irish prisoner who had gone on hunger strike had been left to die. And she saw that if she were to go on hunger strike this time, they'd let her die. And she felt she shouldn't really do that. There's work to be done. So anyway, in Moscow, at the 13th session of this Communist International, a passionate debate took place on the question of the affiliation to the Labour Party. And of course, Sylvia put her case saying, oh, for the Labour Party, as if we didn't know. And Lenin actually intervened on this question, and he said, Comrades Gallagher and Sylvia Pankhurst, these are the people who are arguing you couldn't possibly affiliate to the Labour Party. They can't deny the fact that in the ranks of the Labour Party, the British Socialist Party, who had affiliated, enjoys sufficient freedom to write that certain leaders of the Labour Party are traitors, that these old leaders represent the interests of the bourgeoisie, that they're agents of the bourgeoisie in the working class movement. They can't deny all this because it's absolute truth. So when communists enjoy such freedom, it's their duty to join the Labour Party if they take account of the experience of revolutionaries. So, you know, that's quite extraordinary, isn't it? I can remember when Stop the War, you weren't allowed to criticize the leaders, let alone in those terms, never mind a political party. Anyway, the result of it was that Sylvia was somewhat reluctantly agreed, and the Communist Party British section of the Third International was dissolved, and its members all joined the newly formed Communist Party of Great Britain, which was formed in July, August 1920. But, where we go, this one I want. Well, in September 1921, Sylvia was expelled. Now, what had she done to merit expulsion? Oh, well, the party told her to close down the workers' Dreadnaught, and she refused to do it. Well, it would be like the party telling us to close down Lalcar. We'd definitely refuse to do it. But that wasn't the issue. The issue was what she had written in the workers' Dreadnaught. You know, she herself was convinced, wasn't a proper communist. She was hanging around with this Sylvia chap. They were very strong on workers' control. So the idea is that following the revolution, workers would take charge of the factories and the places of work, and that's really what revolution was about. Which, of course, is nonsense. You know, if you have workers in lots of different factories all over the place, how are the goods going to be distributed? You're going to need some method of exchange if they're all independent of each other. So what you have to have is central planning, where all the factories produce as per the central plan that's been worked out in consultation with everybody. The workers' control should be workers' control of the whole economy, not of their silly little factory. But she didn't understand that. And as I say, she was, I think, at that point very influenced by Silvio and that particular trend in the Italian communist movement. So she wrote an open letter to Lenin in November 1921, which she actually put in the workers' Dreadnaught, asserting that the Bolsheviks had begun to desert communism and were opening Europe to the path taken by the fascists in Italy. She'd serialized Rosa Luxemburg's critique of Bolshevik policy, and you'll all recall that Rosa Luxemburg, another magnificent woman, but she didn't agree with the dictatorship of the proletariat. Well, you know, without the dictatorship of the proletariat, how the hell are you going to hang on to Soviet power? I mean, it's just ridiculous. But anyway, and Luxemburg had already said that the division of land to the peasants was a betrayal of the revolution. And again, it's not ideal, but it's a compromise that has to be made. But this is something that, you know, without some political understanding, you really can't necessarily stomach. So all these rather vicious criticisms were there in the workers' Dreadnaught, and not unnaturally, the Communist Party said, sorry, you've got to hand over control to us. And she said, no. So off you go. She was expelled after only being in the party for about a year. I mean, it was a bit sad, really, because she was a magnificent woman, but you know, she didn't listen. She didn't listen. Anyway, so she started on a new life. So a little bit about her anarcho-syndicalist partner, Silvio Corio. She met in 1917. And through him, she actually took a very great interest in what was happening in Italy. She traveled to Italy, which in the 2 years following the war was in absolute uproar. The peasants and the workers were fighting everywhere. It was called the Biennio Rosso, the Red 2 years. It was an exciting time, you know, to be a communist in Italy. And she became a correspondent for the newspaper L'Ordine Nuovo, which had been established by Gramsci and others. And so she wrote the letter from England that came once a month. You know, initially all these people were very successful. You know, they formed Red Guards and all that kind of thing. But of course, it was the bourgeoisie had to mobilize to put them all down. And this is where the fascists came into it. They mobilized these thugs, basically to go around killing people, which they did fairly effectively, and fascism was brought in to put an end to the workers' militancy. And you'll recall that at the time, everyone thought that Mussolini, the head of the fascists, was a great hero. Churchill very much admired him. He thought this was the way to deal with these, you know, stroppy workers. Kill them all. Kill them all. So anyway, nevertheless, as I say, the ideals, the rather unscientific ideals of these workers were things which had affected Sylvia's thinking, which is why she thought that the Bolshevism had let the side down. But nevertheless, as I point out, she never became a counter-revolutionary. A lot of people, having been disillusioned with Bolshevism, did become counter-revolutionary. Her sister Adela in Australia became a counter-revolutionary, but she didn't. She actually set out to up the fight against fascism, which was very important at that time. And she was very adamant in the fight against colonialism and imperialism. She wrote a book which demanded the emancipation of India. And then she did a lot of work on Ethiopia, because Ethiopia had been had fought against the intervention of the Italians that who tried to colonize it following in the scramble for Africa. And she very admired the fact that the Ethiopians had managed to fight them off. Obviously, in the Second World War, the Italians did occupy, and she would have been very, very concerned to support them in their struggle for emancipation. But nevertheless, here she was. She'd lost interest in the communist movement once she was thrown out in 1921, she'd rather lost her way. And in 1924, she actually closed down the workers' Dreadnaught, and she and Sylvia moved to Woodford Green. I used to live in Woodford, but it had changed a lot since the days when Sylvia was there. It was quite a rural place when she moved there, so it was the equivalent of people that we know who moved to, I don't know, what was it? Those places in Kent where certain comrades of ours used to go in order to get away from the wicked wiles of the city, where their children would learn all sorts of horrible things at school and they'd go to somewhere lovely and peaceful. Anyway, so she went to Woodford for that purpose. And in Woodford, aged 45, she gave birth to her child, Richard, also Sylvia's child. And you know, this is something about her character. She absolutely refused to get married. That was a big thing in those days, to be an unmarried mother. Wow, you know. So the unfortunate Emmeline, who was so bourgeois, not only was her daughter being a communist, but now she was an unmarried mother. Oh no. Anyway, Emmeline cut off all ties and refused to speak to her ever again. I don't think Sylvia would have been all that distressed, because by this time, Emmeline had joined the Conservative Party, because the Conservative Party had given votes to, Conservative government had given votes to women, you know, so everything was all right. Sad end, though, all the same. So the mother died the following year anyway. Let's see. And she maintained, I anticipated all that, didn't I? Never mind, let's move on then. So there she is with Haile Selassie in Ethiopia. Sylvia died in 1956. So the relationship obviously lasted very well. And in 1956, after Sylvia died, she actually moved to Ethiopia. And in Ethiopia, you know, she devoted herself to good works. She inaugurated a hospital and, you know, she did wonderful things for the people there. They accepted her as an honorary Ethiopian. And she was good friends with Haile Selassie, whom she had admired very much. And, you know, she liked to be involved in the modernization of the country. And they appreciated her efforts. And when she died in 1960, she got a heroine's grave at the Holy Trinity Church in Addis Ababa, in an area reserved for Ethiopian patriots. So anyway, that was how it ended. So the only thing I wanted then to add was the conclusion. She lost her way on the question of how a socialist country should be organized. But she was a remarkable woman. She had a big heart. She devoted herself with all her heart and her soul, at whatever cost, to the cause of the working class, to the cause of the downtrodden and oppressed masses, not only in England, but all over the world. She was a great organizer. She was prepared to make any sacrifice necessary. You know, she espoused every progressive cause with great enthusiasm and with great flair. How did she end up losing her way? It was because of her lack of theoretical understanding. She was not a Marxist. She hadn't trained as a Marxist. And, you know, and I think it all goes to show you can be a wonderful human being, prepared to do everything for the working class. But one of the most important things you have to do for the working class was to learn your proletarian theory, your Marxist theory, because without that, you're more likely to let them down than not. But having said that, I also wanted to add that, of course, plenty of people who were very well versed in Marxism found themselves supporting the fatherland in the imperialist war. So it goes to show that theoretical understanding and knowledge in itself isn't enough either. You have to be devoted to the working class as well. You have to have heart and soul as well as brain. And when you put the two together, which hopefully in the party we'll try to do for ourselves and try to encourage in others, then you become a useful servant. You wouldn't want a cook who couldn't cook. You wouldn't want a chauffeur who couldn't drive. You wouldn't want to know a communist who didn't know his Marxism. Okay, thank you.
That was beautiful, Ella. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think Sylvia's is a wonderful example, actually, of exactly what Ella was saying. You know, that selfless attitude that those who want to serve the cause of the working class absolutely have to have. And I think Ella's conclusion is very apt for us as we come towards our next party congress, which will be our 10th, I believe. And apt for us also as we're in this period that we're in a strange hiatus at the moment, a kind of period of collective mourning for Comrade Harpal. We have his memorial meeting coming up in 2 weeks' time, but we're still, you know, every day meeting people who, you know, it's the first time we've met them since Harpal died, and we're sharing our stories and our feelings about him. And I think that Ella's conclusion really points the way to what it was that was so significant about Harpal, because he absolutely had the heart and soul to dedicate himself entirely for the whole of his conscious adult life. You know, he picked up a volume of Lenin when he was 22, and he never put that down for a single day until the day he died. But it was everybody who knew him, everybody who benefited from the huge amount of work he did, whether it was theoretical or organizational. And in this hall, we have people who knew him as both, right? People who read his books and learned at his knee, you know, to understand and appreciate the great content of the great Marxist-Leninists. You know, many of us learned Harpal's favorite quotes of Lenin, Harpal's favorite quotes of Marx, Harpal's favorite quotes from Engels and from Stalin, because they were repeated so often in his books, in his speeches, in his articles, you know, and they're seared on our consciousness. We were sat in our Central Committee meeting today trying to think of our favorite quote of Harpal. And what we realized was all the quotes we associate so strongly with him are quotations from Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Stalin that he would repeat to us. You know, he was a servant of a cause. He was somebody who set himself to master Marxism because he realized that mastering Marxism was the way to free the working and oppressed peoples of the world. And that was what he wanted to do. You know, many people have talked about his anti-imperialism and what a staunch anti-imperialist he was, and he absolutely was. But he was more than an anti-imperialist in that kind of abstract, you know, third worldy kind of way that so many people use that today. He was somebody who understood, really understood, entirely understood, that the only solution to the problem of imperialism is socialism. There's no halfway house. Harpal understood that totally fully, because on the one hand, he's seen the vicious face of imperialism from a child upwards. He saw his home village get ripped apart through partition. He lost his first early childhood friends because they were Muslims who had to be moved to the other side of the border. He saw dead bodies as a young child. He knew there was bloodshed going on, and he knew all of this was a crime of imperialism from which his homeland, Punjab, never recovered to this day, has not recovered. You know, he looked forward to a time when it would in the future recover, when the peoples of the subcontinent would be brought back together again. But he understood this was a massive crime of imperialism. He never saw a white face in his childhood, but he felt the evil of the British occupation of India and looting of India, and the way they stirred up pogroms and communalism amongst people who had lived happily together for millennia, stirred them up against one another and created this crazed bloodshed. Now, we think race riots are bad on the streets of Britain. Can you imagine living through a race riot, essentially a communal riot stirred up by the overlords that leads to such a bloodbath as was witnessed by partition in Punjab? It's a crime of horrific proportions that is hardly appreciated by people today who don't have a personal connection with it, just exactly what that means. How many people, 1 million people killed, on top of all the people uprooted and a land just ripped to pieces, you know, and the ramifications of that, as I say, they echo through the ages. It's something really horrific that's been left for, you know, and liberated India and liberated Pakistan and Bangladesh. You know, they've all had to grow on this, with this as the seed of their new nations. And yes, let's not forget that the British government that oversaw that process was the Labour government that we in Britain are taught to see as the best that workers can hope for. They were the ones that gave us the welfare state because they were so socialist. That's what we're always taught, this absolute lie, right? But Harpal saw this, experienced this as a young child, and grew up with the ramifications of what that meant for his community. So he had a deep-rooted understanding that imperialism is an enemy and that had to be fought. But he also had an intellectual grasp of the fact that this is not just an emotional battle. And it's not just a question of foreigners, it's not whites v blacks. He was determined to understand this properly, and he followed where the answers took him. So when he discovered Lenin and read Lenin on imperialism, he read everything by Lenin, he read everything by Marx and Engels and Lenin and Stalin more than once, right? And what he understood from that was that this is a fight of two systems this is a world in which an old system is dying and a new system is struggling to be born, and the only way to solve these problems and prevent these crimes from continuing is to be part of the movement for socialism. That's the only really anti-imperialist movement. And he worked very hard to bring that understanding to the people of the world. And it's very noticeable that his output went up a level at the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union. It was when the international movement and the national movement, the socialist movement in general, was in disarray, that voices like Harpal's that had such a clear and educated understanding, what Ella was saying, that really deeply scientifically guided mind like Harpal's, was able to keep his balance in the craziness of that time, not to panic, not to even become pessimistic. Yes, it's a big reverse, it's a huge reverse, it's a cataclysm for the working class. As Stalin predicted, the working class and oppressed peoples were seized by the throat, and there's been a blood price paid by the people all over the world. Workers in the West, and especially oppressed peoples abroad, have been paying a blood price for the loss of the socialist homeland since the fall of the Soviet Union. But this is not the end of our story. This is just a lesson. And Harpal was one of the few people able to bring that lesson to us. Number one, what is it that's happened? What do we need to learn about the collapse of socialism and revisionism in the Soviet Union? What happened there? How do we understand it? What brought about this counter-revolution? Number two, to explain to us that Marxism remains valid, and this is why. So the core teachings of Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Stalin, Harpal went back over them all. You know, the question of bourgeois nationalism, the question of Lenin's thesis of imperialism, the question of Trotskyism and all these fake left ideologies that are sent to confuse us, the question of identity politics, the women's question, you know, the race question, all of these he went over during this period. Between 1991 and the year 2000, you know, Harpal brought out books on the most important core topics that British workers in particular need to understand if they're going to re-find their balance, reorient themselves, and get back, sorry, love?
Bearings.
Yeah, get back their bearings and reorient themselves and pick themselves up and carry on with the struggle. And really, you know, Harpal's legacy is immense in that he kept the flame of scientific socialism alive. Of course, he had support from a group of core comrades who understood with him the vital necessity of that work. But I think they would all agree that he was the kind of guiding force of that group and the one who really dedicated himself to scientific mastery to a degree that, you know, none of the rest of us has quite managed to reach. Yet we continue to aspire to that level of scientific depth. But he wasn't just an armchair theoretician. Everybody in this hall knows he was an indefatigable organizer. All of my childhood and all of his life until his health problems created a situation where he was no longer able to travel the way he had. He would go up and down the country to meetings, organizing people. He was on the phone all the time. In fact, he was on the phone all the time until the last couple of weeks of his life, you know, calling, organizing, speaking, training, mobilizing, you know, getting people going. I remember him going up and down the country to address meetings, to deliver bulk copies of Lolkar to branches of the Indian Workers Association through the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, was doing it all the time. You know, he was an organizer, not just, he wasn't a purely theoretical person. And the depth of his theoretical legacy that he leaves us was constantly informed by his experience in the movement. And that's what you also get when you read his books. What you get is constant lessons in how deviations and wrong ideas in the movement express themselves in our work. What these ideas do in a movement. When you're trying to organize against the war, what happens when you come up against revisionists and Trotskyites? What are the lines they bring? When you read Harpal's books, you're also getting equipped for all the problems you are going to meet as you go about your life of trying to recruit workers for the socialist cause. Because there's lots of people out there who are also saying that they're socialists, but they're bringing all of this wrong ideas into the movement. And going through Harpal's work, you have a constant lesson in how to apply the teachings of Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin, Mao also, to the living struggle and what that experience was that he went through, but how it applies to what we're going through ourselves today. So they are, as the classics were, they are very much a guide to action. They're not just historical documents. These are very much living lessons for us in the struggle that we face today. So, you know, I have a strong feeling that the work of Harpal and his comrades is actually coming now into its own. In a way, for many years, there was very, very few of us who understood that what Harpal had done was so significant and who were being educated by that work as we came up as young people in the movement. But a whole new generation of people, and not only in Britain, but all over the world, where people are wanting to discover Marxist science, they are coming to Harpal's works. And that is something that is not going to stop because Harpal has died. In fact, the need for the lessons that Harpal's works encapsulate is growing right now. And it's going to keep growing. It's accelerating in its growth. And I have a strong feeling that the numbers of people who today have heard of Harpal is not the limit of Harpal's reach. I think that his works are going to actually find a far greater audience in the coming period than they ever did during his lifetime. And that really is a fitting legacy for the huge work that he's done. He kept the flame of Marxism, Leninism alive in Britain during a period when it was the hardest possible thing to do. We are here today, our party is here today because of that work that he did. The British working class has the foundation of a genuine revolutionary movement because of the work he did. And if he hadn't been doing that work, we wouldn't have that. That chain would have been broken in Britain. And the working class, although it needs a revolutionary communist party, would be flailing around trying to work out how to form one, flailing around trying to get its theoretical foundations worked out, as we see is happening in many other countries right now. You know, the working class needs its theoretical guidelines, it needs its organizational principles, and it's flailing around trying to work out what they should be because it doesn't have the teaching coming through it in the unbroken chain, which is what Harpal really represented for us. You know, this unbroken chain of genuine revolutionaries going all the way back to the founders of our movement. And so he performed a huge service to the workers of the world and particularly to the working class of Britain. And I think that is going to be more and more appreciated as the coming period unfolds.